Chapter 10. The Ballad of the Dreaming Weavers, Cannabis and Culture. No plant has been a continuous part of the human family longer than the hemp plant. Hemp seeds and remains of ancient cordage have been found in the earliest strata of many Eurasian habitation sites. Cannabis, a native of the heartlands of Central Asia, was spread throughout the world by human agency. It was introduced into Africa at a very early date, and cold-adapted strains traveled with the early human beings who crossed the land bridge into the New World. Because of its pandemic range and environmental adaptability, cannabis has had a major impact on human social forms and cultural self-images. When the resin of the cannabis plant is collected together into black sticky balls, its effects are comparable to the power of a hallucinogen, providing that the material is eaten. This is the classic hashish. The thousands of names by which cannabis is known in hundreds of languages are testament not only to its cultural history and ubiquity, but also its power to move the language-making faculty of the poetic soul. Kunuhu, it is called in an Assyrian letter tentatively dated 685 BC. 100 years later, it is referred to as Kanapu, the root of the Greek and Latin cannabis. It is bang, bang, and BBNJ. It is ganja, gangika, and ganga. Asa to the Japanese is daga to the Hottentots. It is also kief and keef and kerp and ma. American slang alone contains a prodigious number of words for cannabis. Even before 1940, before it was part of mainstream white culture, cannabis was known as muggles, mooter, reefer, griefa, griffo, Mary Warner, Mary Weaver, Mary Jane, Indian hay, loco weed, love weed, joy smoke, giggle smoke, bambalacha, mohaski, moo, and mooka. Such terms were the mantras of an experientially oriented underclass religion that worshipped a jolly green goddess. Hashish. Hashish is several thousands of years old, although at what point human beings began to gather and concentrate cannabis resin in this way is not clear. Smoking of cannabis products, the most efficient and rapid way of obtaining their effects, reached Europe rather late. In fact, smoking itself was only introduced into Europe when Columbus returned with tobacco from his second trip to the New World. This is rather remarkable. A major human behavior pattern was unknown in Europe until quite recently. One might make the observation that Europeans generally seemed resistant to the development of innovative strategies of drug use. For example, the enema, another means of administering strong plant extracts, was also developed in the New World by Indians of the equatorial Amazonian forests to whom natural rubber was familiar. Its development allowed experimentation with plants whose effects or taste were objectionable when taken orally. It is not possible to say with certainty when cannabis was first smoked, or indeed whether smoking was once part of the cultural repertoire of Old World peoples and then forgotten, only to be reintroduced from the New World at the time of the Spanish conquest. For while smoking was unknown to the Greeks and the Romans, it may have flourished in the Old World in prehistoric times. Archaeological digging at Non Nok Ta in Thailand has yielded in graves dated 15,000 BP the remains of animal bones that appear to have had plant material repeatedly burned in their hollow centers. The favorite instrument for the smoking of cannabis in India, even to this day, is a chellam, a simple wooden, ceramic, or soapstone tube that is packed with hashish and tobacco. How long have chellams been used in India is a matter of debate, but there can be little doubt that the method is extremely effective. The Scythians. The Scythians, a nomadic Central Asian barbarian group who entered Eastern Europe around 700 BC, are the people who brought the use of cannabis to the European world. Herodotus describes their novel method of self-intoxication, a kind of cannabis sweat lodge. They have a sort of hemp growing in this country, Scythia, very like flax, except in thickness and height. In this respect, the hemp is far superior. It grows both spontaneously and from cultivation. When therefore the Scythians have taken some seed of this hemp, they creep under the cloths of the sweat lodge and then put the seed on the red-hot stones. But this being put on smokes and produces such a steam that no Grecian vapor bath would surpass it. The Scythians, transported by the vapor, shout aloud. Elsewhere, Herodotus comments on another similar method. The Scythians have discovered other trees that produce fruit of a peculiar kind, which the inhabitants, when they meet together in companies and have lit a fire, throw on the fire as they sit round in a circle, and that by inhaling the fumes of the burning fruit that has been thrown on, they become intoxicated by the odor, just as the Greeks do by wine. and that the more fruit that is thrown on, the more intoxicated they become, until they rise up to dance and betake themselves to singing. The passage from Herodotus makes clear that though the Scythians had discovered that inhaling the smoke of cannabis was the most effective way to enjoy it, nevertheless, they were unable to make the creative leap to the invention of the pipe or cellum. The Greek herbalist and natural scientist Dioscorides also described cannabis, but until effective smoking practices were adopted, it made no inroads into European and American cultures. India and China. Chinese tradition holds that hemp cultivation began as early as the 28th century BC, when the Emperor Shen Nung taught the cultivation of hemp for fiber. And around AD 220, the physician Hoa To evidently recommended hemp preparations and wine as an anesthetic. After a certain number of days or the end of a month, the patient finds he has recovered without having experienced the slightest pain during the operation. Cannabis was used and regarded as a plant of great spiritual power for many centuries in India before it was first smoked. Opium, too, seems to have been used for many centuries before the effectiveness of smoking it was discovered. Awareness of hemp in India cannot be documented before 1000 BC, but by that time it was known as a remedy, and the names for it in use in the earliest Indian pharmacopoeias indicate that its activity as a euphoriant was clearly understood. General awareness of the properties of cannabis grew very slowly and cannot be assumed to be widespread until around the 10th century AD, only shortly before the Islamic invasion of Hindu India. Cannabis had associations with the esoteric, hence secret side of Muslim and Hindu religiosity. Esoteric spirituality, the yogic practices of sadhu, and the emphasis on the direct experience of the transcendent are all little more than aspects of the veneration of cannabis in India. J. Campbell Oman, a late 19th century observer of Indian folkways, wrote, "It would be an interesting philosophical study to endeavor to trace the influence of these powerful narcotics on the minds and bodies of the itinerant monks who habitually use them. We may be sure that these hemp drugs, known since very early times in the East, are not irresponsible for some of its wild dreamings." Cannabis as a cultural style. Oman touches here on a very fruitful theme. The degree to which the style and way of life of an entire culture can be imbued with the attitudes and assumptions engendered by a particular psychoactive plant or drug. There is something to the notion that the architectural styles and design motifs of Mughal Delhi or 10th century Isfahan are somehow derivative of or inspired by the visions of hashish. And there is something to the notion that alcohol channeled the development of social forms and cultural self-image in feudal Europe. Aesthetic assumptions and styles are indices of the level and kind of understanding and awareness that a society sanctions. Each plant relationship will tend to accentuate some concerns and diminish others. Outpourings of style and aesthetically managed personal display are usually anathema to the nuts and bolts mentality of dominator cultures. In dominator cultures without any living traditions of use of plants that dissolve social conditioning, such displays are usually felt to be the prerogative of women. Men who focus on such concerns are often assumed to be homosexuals. That is, they are not following the accepted canons of male behavior within the dominator model. The longer hair lengths for men seen with the rise of marijuana use in the United States in the 1960s were a textbook case of an influx of apparently feminine values accompanying the use of a boundary-dissolving plant. The hysterical reaction to such a minor adjustment in folkways revealed the insecurity and sense of danger felt by the male ego in the presence of any factor that might tend to restore the importance of partnership in human affairs. In this context, it is interesting to note that cannabis occurs in both a male and a female form, and it is the identification, care, and propagation of the female of the species that is the total concern of the grower interested in the narcotic power of the plant. This is because the resin is the exclusive product of the female plant. Not only do males not produce a usable drug, but if the pollen from male plants reaches females, the females will begin to set seed and will cease their production of resin. It is thus a kind of happy coincidence that the subjective effects of ingesting cannabis and the care and attention needed to produce a good resin strain both conspire to accentuate values that are oriented toward honoring and preserving the feminine. Of all the pandemic plant intoxicants inhabiting the earth, cannabis is second only to mushrooms in its promotion of the social values and sensory ratios that typify the original partnership societies. How else are we to explain the unrelenting persecution of cannabis use in the face of overwhelming evidence that, of all the intoxicants ever used, cannabis is among the most benign? Its social consequences are negligible compared with those of alcohol. Cannabis is anathema to the Dominator culture because it deconditions or decouples users from accepted values. Because of its subliminally psychedelic effect, cannabis, when pursued as a lifestyle, places a person in intuitive contact with less goal-oriented and less competitive behavior patterns. For these reasons, marijuana is unwelcome in the modern office environment, while a drug such as coffee, which reinforces the values of industrial culture, is both welcomed and encouraged. Cannabis use is correctly sensed as heretical and deeply disloyal to the values of male dominance and stratified hierarchy. Legalization of marijuana is thus a complex issue, since it involves legitimating a social factor that might ameliorate or even modify ego-dominant values. Legalization and taxation of cannabis would provide a tax base that could help clean up the national deficit. Instead, we continue to hurl millions of dollars into marijuana eradication, a policy that creates suspicion and a permanent criminal class in communities that are otherwise among the most law-abiding in the country. As indicated, society's contempt for the cannabis user is a thinly disguised contempt for the values of community and the feminine. How else to explain the media's need to endlessly repudiate the psychedelic drug use and underground social experiments of the 60s? The fear that the flower children engendered in the establishment becomes understandable when analyzed in the light of the idea that what confronted the establishment was an outbreak of genderless partnership thinking based on a diminished sense of self-importance. Classical cannabis. The Roman natural historian Pliny, AD 23-79, reproduces a fragment from Democritus concerning a plant called thalassigal or potamogus that many scholars consider a reference to cannabis. Taken in drink, it produces a delirium, which presents to the fancy visions of a most extraordinary nature. The Theangelus, he says, grows upon Mount Libanus in Syria, upon the chain of mountains called Dicte in Crete, and at Babylon and Susa in Persia. An infusion of it imparts powers of divination to the Magi. The Gelatophilus, too, is a plant found in Bactriana and on the banks of the Borysthenes. Taken internally with myrrh and wine, all sorts of visionary forms present themselves, exciting the most immoderate laughter. Dioscorides, writing during the 1st century, gave an excellent description of cannabis and mentions its use in rope-making and medicine, but he says nothing of its intoxicating properties. Because the climate favored the growth of hemp and Islam encouraged its use over alcohol, in the Near Eastern and Arab worlds, cannabis became the intoxicant of choice for many. This predilection for hashish and cannabis was already very old at the time of the Prophet, which explains why alcohol is explicitly forbidden to the faithful, but hashish is a matter of theological disputation. By AD 950, use and abuse of hashish is widespread enough that it comes to occupy a prominent position in the literature of the period. A perfect encapsulation of the attitudes of Dominator society toward cannabis is contained in the following, one of the earliest descriptions we possess of addictive behavior with this plant. A Muslim priest exhorting in the mosque against the use of bhang, a plant of which the principal quality is to intoxicate and induce sleep, was so carried away with the violence of his discourse that a paper containing some of the prohibited drug which often enslaved him fell from his breast into the midst of his audience. The priest, without loss of countenance, cried immediately, "There is this enemy, this demon of which I have told you. The force of my words has put it to flight. Take care that in quitting me it does not hurl itself on one of you and possess him." No one dared to touch it. After the sermon, the zealous sophist recovered his bhang. As this story makes clear, the ego of the monotheist is capable of the most extraordinary feats of self-delusion. Cannabis and the language of story. Cannabis is a multi-purpose plant. It very early came to the attention of hunter-gatherers as a source of cordage for weaving and rope-making. But unlike other cordage plants, the flax of Central Asia or the chimbira of the Amazon, cannabis is also psychoactive. In this context, it is interesting to note that the English vocabulary that refers to spoken discourse is often the same as that used to describe cordage making and weaving. One weaves a story, or unravels an incident, or spins a yarn. We follow the thread of a story and stitch together an excuse. Lies are made from whole cloth, reality is an endless golden braid. Does this shared vocabulary reflect an ancient connection between the intoxicating hemp plant and the intellectual processes that lay behind the discovery of the art of weaving and of storytelling? I suggest that such may well be the case. Cannabis was the most likely plant candidate to replace the sacred psilocybin mushrooms of the older cultures of the Near East. Though this transition from mushrooms to cannabis lies far in the past, its legacy to the present era is the association of cannabis with the style of the partnership society. And indeed, the growing presence of cannabis in Vedic society and later in Islam may have acted to slow the rise of dominator values. Certainly it gave encouragement to heterodox forces, Shivites in the case of Hinduism and Sufis in the case of Islam, who made no secret of their reliance on cannabis as a source of religious inspiration that was particularly feminine in emphasis. The role of cannabis in European society is complex. Marco Polo, whose exploits and travel descriptions of the mysterious East did so much to enrich and catalyze the European imagination, gave one of the first and most widely read accounts of the use of hashish when he repeated the popular folktale of the Old Man of the Mountain, Ibn el-Sabah, reputed leader of the violent cult of the Hashishin, the infamous sect of assassins. According to the legend, young men wishing to be initiated into the sect were given large doses of hashish and then introduced into an artificial paradise, a hidden valley of exotic floral gardens, splashing fountains, and nubile young women. They were told that return to this land of dreams was only possible after they had carried out certain acts of political murder. Indeed, Hashishin and assassin are thought to be etymologically related. The truth of this old story is widely disputed, but there can be no doubt that it was the circulation of the story in Europe that gave cannabis its blackened reputation and its fascination. Some 500 years after Marco Polo, French administrators of Napoleonic Egypt failed utterly in their efforts to control the production and sale of cannabis preparations. In response to a ban on sales, Greek smugglers immediately began a lucrative underground business of importing hashish into Egypt. Militarily, Napoleon's expedition into Egypt was a failure, but as an effort at the cross-fertilization of disparate cultures, it was a resounding success. Napoleon took with him into Egypt an excellent library and 175 scholars who observed, sketched, and collected linguistic and cultural information. This effort ultimately resulted in the publication of 24 volumes, Description d'Égypte, between 1809 and 1813. These volumes inspired a wide variety of travel books, and in general were a tremendous stimulus to the European imagination. Orientomania and cannabis in Europe. While Napoleon struggled with the prevalence of cannabis use in Egypt, new intellectual forces were stirring in Europe. Romanticism, Orientomania, and a fascination with psychology and the paranormal all combined with a well-established upper-class craze for opium and the opium tincture, laudanum, to create a climate in which the reputed pleasures of hashish could be explored by daring and unconventional souls. The legal and intellectual ambiance of drug-taking in the early 19th century could hardly have been more different from that of our own times. Opium and hashish were not controlled substances, and no opprobrium was attached to their use. Tobacco and coffee had long since been introduced into Europe and become indispensable parts of the rituals of European civilization, so it was not surprising that the extravagant tales of travelers concerning narcotic raptures and vistas of transcendental ecstasy acted to promote experimentation with cannabis. By the early 1840s, a group of French writers, among them Théophile Gautier, Baudelaire, Gérard de Nerval, Dumas, and Balzac, as well as a number of sculptors, painters, and other bohemians, had formed the now famous Club des Hashichons. The club held weekly meetings in damask-hung rooms of the Hôtel Luzon in Ile Saint-Louis in Paris. At these meetings, the world traveler and psychiatrist J.J. Moreau de Tours provided a form of jellied Algerian hashish called dawamesk. The meetings were the private explorations of successful and respected literary figures. Nevertheless, only a few years later, during the Paris Uprising of 1848, the student firebrands carried banners through the streets demanding free availability of cannabis and ether. In 1842, the English physician W.B. O'Shaughnessy became the first to introduce ganja, potent Indian hemp, to England in his Bengal Pharmacopoeia. Cannabis became a part of English medical practice and hence a part of the inventory of every English apothecary. The relation between opium and hashish in the shaping of the European imagination is complex and synergistic. Opium has a much longer history of wide use in the West than has cannabis. Opium was known and used by physicians since at least late Egyptian and Minoan times, and it played a major part in the late decadent phase of Minoan religion. Cannabis was introduced into Europe later, and largely as a consequence of the interest in altered states that had already been kindled by opium enthusiasts. Though cannabis had been used in the East for many centuries, it is very unlikely that more than a handful of Europeans were aware of its existence before the sensational account of Marco Polo appeared around 1290. In spite of the fact that the German physician Johannes Weir mentioned the use of hashish by groups of witches in the 16th century, drugs based on hemp were absent from the materia medica of alchemy, and were probably not brought into Europe in any quantity until O'Shaughnessy and his French contemporary, Aubert Roche, advocated their use around 1840. In 1845, J.J. Moreau de Tours published his Du hashish et de l'aliénation mentale, Hashish and Mental Illness. His detailed accounts of the effects of hashish sparked interest in both medical and literary circles, and set off a wave of experimentation. Even so, interest in hashish never traveled much beyond the Parisian circles in which Moreau himself moved. Hashish eating never became a European craze in the 19th century. Use of hashish continued to be mostly confined to the Near and Middle East. Cannabis in 19th century America. It was not the English or the French, but the Americans who created a literature around the charms and phantasmagoria of hashish. In so doing, they were following the example of English opium habitués such as Coleridge and De Quincey. Thus, their writings were strongly influenced by the joys and horrors style that had made De Quincey's name a household word. Their descriptions of the effects of cannabis make it abundantly clear that for them, it had all the impact of a shattering metaphysical revelation. Today, hashish eating, save for the occasional holiday cannabis cookie, is almost unknown as a method of cannabis ingestion. For us moderns, cannabis is inevitably something that one smokes. This was not true for the 19th century, which seems always to have eaten its hashish in the form of confections imported from the Middle East. These visions and the resulting intoxications leave no doubt that this method turns hashish into a powerful engine for the exploration of inner vistas, of fantasies and awareness. The first exploratory journey into the teeming cosmos of cannabis to appear in print was an account by American traveler Bayard Taylor, first published in Atlantic Monthly in 1854. The sense of limitation, of the confinement of our senses within the bounds of our own flesh and blood, instantly fell away. The walls of my frame were burst outward and tumbled into ruin, and without thinking what form I wore, losing sight even of all idea of form, I felt that I existed throughout a vast extent of space. The spirit, demon shall I rather say, of hashish had entire possession of me. I was cast upon the flood of his illusions and drifted helplessly whithersoever they might choose to bear me. The thrills which ran through my nervous system became more rapid and fierce, accompanied with sensations that steeped my whole being in unutterable rapture. I was encompassed by a sea of light, through which played the pure harmonious colors that are born of light. While endeavoring, in broken expression, to describe my feelings to friends, who sat looking upon me incredulously, not yet having been affected by the drug, I suddenly found myself at the foot of the great pyramid of Cheops. The tapering courses of yellow limestone gleamed like gold in the sun, and the pile rose so high that it seemed to lean for support upon the blue arch of the sky. I wished to ascend it, and the wish alone placed me immediately upon its apex, lifted thousands of feet above the wheat fields and palm groves of Egypt. I cast my eyes downward, and to my astonishment saw that it was built not of limestone, but of huge square plugs of Cavendish tobacco. Words cannot paint the overwhelming sense of the ludicrous which I then experienced. I writhed on my chair in an agony of laughter, which was only relieved by the vision melting away like a dissolving view. Till out of my confusion of indistinct images and fragments of images, another and more wonderful vision arose. The more vividly I recall the scene which followed, the more carefully I restore its different features and separate the many threads of sensation which it wove into one gorgeous web, the more I despair of representing its exceeding glory. I was moving over the desert, not upon the rocking dromedary, but seated in a bark made of mother of pearl and studded with jewels of surpassing luster. The sand was of grains of gold, and my keel slid through them without jar or sound. The air was radiant with excess of light, though no sun was to be seen. I inhaled the most delicious perfumes and harmonies, such as Beethoven may have heard in dreams but never wrote, floated around me. The atmosphere itself was light, odor, music, and each and all sublimated beyond anything the sober senses are capable of receiving. Before me, for 1,000 leagues as it seemed, stretched a vista of rainbows, whose colors gleamed with the splendor of gems, arches of living amethyst, sapphire, emerald, topaz, and ruby. By thousands and tens of thousands they flew past me as my dazzling barge sped down the magnificent arcade, yet the vista still stretched as far as ever before me. I reveled in a sensuous Elysium, which was perfect because no sense was left ungratified, but beyond all my mind was filled with a boundless feeling of triumph. Such descriptions go a long way toward making clear why the artificial paradise was so alluring to the romantic imagination. It was almost as though one were made for the other. And indeed, the Romantics, with their attention to the dramatic moods of nature and their cultivation of a sensitivity that their critics found feminine, bear all the signs of an incipient partnership revival. With the reportage of Bayard Taylor, we are firmly in the domain of modern drug literature and modern values vis-a-vis the content of the intoxication. Taylor is impressed by the beauty, power, and general depth of information contained in the experience. His approach is not hedonistic, but knowledge-seeking, and for him, as for us, the drug states raise questions about human psychology. Evolving drug attitudes. This scientific attitude was typical of the 19th century literate user of opium and hashish. Usually investigators began their involvement with these substances in order to fire the creative imagination, or for a vaguely defined inspiration. Similar motives were behind the use of marijuana by the writers of the Beat generation, as well as the jazz artists before them and the rockers after them. Few myths of the underground culture invite as much current scorn as the notion that cannabis could contribute to a creative lifestyle. Nevertheless, a portion of the cannabis-using community continues to use it in this way. The pharmacological profile of a drug defines only some of its parameters. The context, or setting, in Leary and Metzner's fortunate turn of phrase, is at least as important. The recreational context for substance use, as currently understood in the United States, is an atmosphere that trivializes the cognitive impact of the substance used. Low doses of most drugs that affect the central nervous system are felt by the organism as artificial stimulation or energy, which can be directed outward in the form of physical activity in order both to express the energy and to quench it. This pharmacological fact lies behind most of the recreational drug craze, whether legal or illegal. An environment dense with social signals, noise, and visual distraction, a nightclub, for example, is typical of the culturally validated context for use of recreational drugs. In our culture, private drug taking is viewed as dubious. Solitary drug use is viewed as positively morbid, and indeed all introspection is seen this way. The archaic model for use of psychoactive plants, including cannabis, is quite the opposite. Ritual, isolation, and sensory deprivation are the techniques used by the archaic shaman seeking to journey in the world of the spirits and ancestors. There is no doubt that cannabis is trivialized as a commodity and is degraded by the designation recreational drug. But there is also no doubt that when used occasionally in a context of ritual and culturally reinforced expectation of a transformation of consciousness, cannabis is capable of nearly the full spectrum of psychedelic effects associated with hallucinogens. Fitzhugh Ludlow. After Bayard Taylor, the next great commentator on the phenomenon of hashish was the irrepressible Fitzhugh Ludlow. This little-known bon vivant of 19th century literature began a tradition of pharmo-picaresque literature that would find later practitioners in William Burroughs and Hunter S. Thompson. Ludlow, as a freshman at Union College in 1855, decided to explore scientifically the powers of hashish while attending a student tea. I was sitting at the tea table when the thrill smote me. I had handed my cup to Miss Milvain to replenish for the first time, and as she was about, restoring it to me brimming with a draught which cheers but not inebriates. I should be loath to calculate the arc through which her hand appeared to me to travel on its way to the side of my plate. The wall grew populous with dancing satyrs. Chinese mandarins nodded idiotically in all the corners, and I felt strongly the necessity of leaving the table before I betrayed myself. There is in Ludlow's Cannabis reportage a wonderful distillation of all that was zany in the Yankee transcendentalist approach. Ludlow creates a literary persona not unlike the poet John Shade in Nabokov's Pale Fire, a character who allows us to see deeper into his predicament than he can see himself. Part genius, part madman, Ludlow lies halfway between Captain Ahab and P.T. Barnum, a kind of Mark Twain on hashish. There's a wonderful charm to his free-spirited, pseudo-scientific openness as he makes his way into the shifting dunescapes of the world of hashish. How far hashish throws light upon the most interior of the mental arcana is a question which will be dogmatically decided in two diametrically opposite ways. The man who believes in nothing which does not, in some way, become tangent to his bodily organs will instinctively withdraw himself into the fortress of what he supposes to be antique common sense and cry "madman" from within. He will reject all of experience under stimulus and the facts which it professedly evolved as truth with the final and unanswerable verdict of insanity. There is another class of men which has its type in him who, while acknowledging the corporeal senses as very important in the present nutriment and muniment of our being, is convinced that they give him appearances alone. Not things as they are in their essence and their law, classified harmoniously with reference to their source, but only as they affect him through the different adits of the body. This man will be prone to believe the mind, in its prerogative of the only self-conscious being in the universe, has the right and the capacity to turn inward to itself for an answer to the puzzling enigmas of the world. Arguing thus, the man, albeit a visionary, will recognize the possibility of discovering from mind, in some of its extraordinarily awakened states, a truth, or a collection of truths which do not become manifest in his everyday condition. Cannabis in the 20th century. The history of cannabis in the United States after Ludlow was at first a happy one. Cannabis use was neither stigmatized nor popularized. This situation lasted until the early 1930s, when the crusades of Harry J. Anslinger, U.S. Commissioner of Narcotics, created a public hysteria. Anslinger appears to have acted largely at the behest of American chemical and petrochemical companies interested in eliminating hemp as a competitor in the areas of lubricants, food, plastics, and fiber. Anslinger in the Yellow Press characterized cannabis as the weed of death. William Randolph Hearst popularized the term marijuana, with a clear intent of linking it to a mistrusted dark-skinned underclass. Yet it has been extraordinarily difficult for science to state exactly what the objections to the cannabis habit are. Patterns of government funding for research make it virtually certain that Caesar will hear only what is pleasing to Caesar. Despite all the pressures brought against it, cannabis use rose until today. Cannabis may well be America's single largest agricultural product. This is one of the most persistent aspects of the great paradigm shift that I am here calling the archaic revival. It indicates that the innate drive to restore the psychological balance typifying the partnership society, once it finds a suitable vehicle, is not easily deterred. Everything about cannabis that makes it inimical to contemporary bourgeois values endears it to the archaic revival. It diminishes the power of ego, has a mitigating effect on competitiveness, causes one to question authority, and reinforces the notion of the merely relative importance of social values. No other drug can compete with cannabis for its ability to satisfy the innate yearnings of archaic boundary dissolution and yet leave intact the structures of ordinary society. If every alcoholic were a pothead, if every crack user were a pothead, if every smoker smoked only cannabis, the social consequences of the drug problem would be transformed. Yet, as a society, we are not ready to discuss the possibility of self-managed addictions and the possibility of intelligently choosing the plants we ally ourselves to. In time, and perhaps out of desperation, this will come. Part 3. Hell. Chapter 11. Complacencies of the peignoir. Sugar, coffee, tea, and chocolate. Long ago, motivated by dwindling resources and changing climate, our proto-hominid ancestors learned to test the natural products in the environment as sources of food. Modern primates such as baboons still do this. An unusual or never-before-encountered source of food is approached gingerly, examined carefully for visual appearance and odor, and then tentatively placed in the mouth and held there, not swallowed. After a few moments, the animal makes the decision to swallow the morsel or to spit it out. Such a procedure has been repeated uncounted times over the long ages of human dietary definition. Obviously, a balance must be struck between excluding foods that would be outright injurious to the individual's health and reproductive ability and including as many sources of nutrition as possible. Evolutionary logic dictates that in situations of food scarcity, those animals able and willing to tolerate many marginal foods will be more evolutionarily successful than those that can accept only a limited number of items into their diet. In other words, there will be pressure on a given animal to broaden its definition of what are acceptable foods by broadening its tastes. Broadening our taste. Broadening of tastes or acquiring a taste is a process that is learned. It is a process with both a psychological and biochemical component. The process of acquiring a taste is an extremely complex one. On the one hand, it entails overcoming the inertia of established habits, those habits that exclude the potential new food item, seeing it as exotic, unfamiliar, poisonous, or associated with enemies or social outcasts. And on the other hand, it involves an adaptation to a chemically exotic food. This process brings into action involuntary systems such as the immune system. It also involves psychological mechanisms such as wanting to accept the new food item for reasons that may be as much social as nutritional. In the case of hallucinogenic plants, the shifts in self-image and societal role that often follow their acceptance are rapid and massive. But we should remember that hallucinogens are at the dramatic end of this scale. What of the countless plants that impart flavoring, but confer little nutritional value and negligible psychoactivity? They too have managed to become items habitually used by human beings. In fact, they went from being the exotic luxuries of a tiny leisure class in Roman times to commercial commodities that focused the vast European efforts at exploration and colonization, that drove the engines of mercantilism and empire building, which replaced the inward-turned medieval stasis in Christian Europe. Variety is the spice of life, is an adage familiar to us all. Yet when we examine the impact of plants and plant products on the history of human beings, it seems more true to say that spice is the variety of life. Medieval times and their clothes are a case in point. Dominator culture has never been more powerfully entrenched than in Christian Europe after the eclipse of the Roman Empire. And it probably is safe to say that scarcely ever have human populations existed in such a prolonged situation of drug scarcity and lack of chemical stimulation. Variety, which promotes learning and eases boredom, had too long been suppressed in Europe. Medieval Europe was one of the most constipated, neurotic, and woman-hating societies ever to exist. It was a society dying to escape from itself, a society obsessed with moral rectitude and sexual repression. It was a society chained to the land, ruled by gouty, beef-eating men wearing dresses but suppressing women. Is it any wonder, then, that dyes and spices, hardly the stuff of social revolutions, became an absolute mania for medieval Europe? Such was the strength of this mania that the arts of shipbuilding and navigation, and the banking and the trading industries all turned to serve the near addiction that most Europeans felt for these things. Spices gave food, and hence life, a variety never known before. Dyes, new dyeing techniques, and exotic fabrics revolutionized fashion. Life without spice. It is difficult for most people born into a society of abundance, sexual gratification, and high-definition TV to imagine the stultifying dullness of most of the societies of the past. The splendor of the great societies of the past was essentially just a display of variety in colors, fabrics, materials, and visual design. Such displays of variety were particularly the prerogative of the ruler and the court. The novelty of the costumes and the appointments of the court was somehow a direct index of its power. Thus it was when the emerging bourgeoisie of the late Middle Ages began importing dyes and spices, silks, and fine manufactured objects into Europe. I can personally attest to the power of color and variety over the human imagination. My periods of jungle isolation doing field work in the upper Amazon taught me how quickly the bewildering multiplicity of civilized life can be forgotten and then hungered for almost like the withdrawal from a powerful drug. After weeks in the jungle, one's mind is filled with plans for the restaurants to be visited once back in civilization, the music to be heard, the movies seen. Once after many days in the rainforest, I went to a village to ask permission to make plant collections in the tribal area. The only high-tech intrusion into the primitive circumstances of the tribe was a cheesecake calendar brought from Iquitos and proudly affixed to the thatched wall directly behind the headman of the village. As I talked with him, my gaze returned again and again to the calendar, not the content, but the colors: magenta, cyan, and apricot. The terrible and obsessive attraction to variety was as haunting as the lure of any drug. The dyes and spices of the more technically advanced and aesthetically refined world of Islam entered the bloodstream of dreary Christian Europe with the force of a hallucinogenic drug. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, and cardamom, and dozens of other exotic spices, flavorings, and dyes arrived to brighten the palate and the wardrobe of a wool-swaddled beer and bread culture. Our own culture during the last few years has seen a similar, though more superficial trend in the rise of the yuppie craze for novelty and new exotic restaurants from ethnic to nouvelle. As school children, we are taught that the spice trade ended the Middle Ages and created the basis of modern trade and commerce. What we are not aware of is the fact that the breakup of Christian medieval Europe occurred as a result of an epidemic obsession with the new, the exotic, and the delightful, in short, with consciousness-expanding substances. Drugs such as coffee, wormwood, and opium, dyes, silks, rare woods, gems, and even human beings were brought back to Europe and displayed almost like the plunder of a looted extraterrestrial civilization. The notion of Oriental splendor, with its luxury, its sensuality, and its unexpectedly outre design motifs, acted to transform not only aesthetic conventions, but canons of social behavior and individual self-image. The names of cities of the Silk Road, such as Samarkand and Ecbatana, became mantras, bespeaking worlds of refinement and luxury previously associated only with paradise. Social boundaries were dissolved, old problems were seen in a new light, and new secular classes emerged to challenge the power monopoly of popes and kings. In short, there was a sudden acceleration of novelty and appearance of new social forms, the telltale tracks of a quantum leap forward in the power of the European imagination. Once again, pursuit of plants and of the mental stimulation they induce was propelling a portion of the human family into experimentation with new social forms, new technologies, and a sudden expansion of language and imagination. Pressure to expand the spice trade remade the arts of navigation, shipbuilding, diplomacy, warfare, geography, and economic planning. Once again, the unconscious drive to mimic and thus partly recapture the lost symbiosis with the vegetable world was acting as a catalyst to dietary experimentation and to a restless quest for new plants and new relationships with plants, including new forms of intoxication. Enter sugar. When the thirst for variety was slaked by massive and continuous importation of spices, dyes, and flavorings, the infrastructure that had been put in place turned its attention to fulfilling other cravings for variety, specifically to the production and shipping of sugar, of chocolate, tea, and coffee, and of distilled alcohol, all of which are drugs. Our present global trading system was created to cater to people's inherent need for variety and stimulation. It did this with a single-minded intensity that brooked no interference from the church or the state. Neither moral scruples nor physical barriers were able to stand in its way. Now we may appear to ourselves to have succeeded only too well. Now any spice or drug, no matter how restricted its traditional area of use, can be identified and produced or synthesized for rapid export and sale to hungry markets anywhere on the globe. Worldwide pandemics of substance abuse now become possible. The importation of tobacco smoking into Europe in the 16th century was the first and most obvious example. It was followed by many others, ranging from the forced spread of opium use in China by the British, through the opium craze in 18th century England, to the spread of distilled alcohol abuse among the North American Indian tribes. Of the many new commodities that made their way into Europe during the breakup of the medieval stasis, one in particular emerged as the new spice or drug of choice. This was cane sugar. Sugar had been known for centuries as a rare medicinal substance. The Romans knew that it was derived from a bamboo-like grass, but the tropical conditions needed for the cultivation of sugarcane ensured that sugar would be a rare and imported commodity in Europe. Only in the 19th century, at the encouragement of Napoleon I, were sugar beets developed as an alternative to cane sugar. Sugarcane is known to occur as a wild plant, and the genus is well represented in tropical Asia, and at least 5 species are native to India. Sugarcane, Saccharum officinarum, has doubtless undergone considerable hybridization during its long history of domestication. The Persian king Khusra I, AD 531 to 578, whose court was near Jundi Shapur, dispatched envoys to India to investigate rumors of exotic drugs. Among those drugs brought to Jundi Shapur from India was sukar, Persian shakar or shakar, Sanskrit sarkara, our sugar, unknown to Herodotus and Ctesias, but known to Nearchus and Onesicritus as reed honey, supposed to have been made from reeds by bees. Legend relates that Khusra discovered a store of sugar amongst the treasures taken in 527 at the capture of Dastagrid. The juice of the sugar cane was purified and made into sugar in India about 8300, and now the cane began to be cultivated about Jundi Shapur, where there were sugar mills at an early date. At that time and for long afterwards, sugar was used only to sweeten otherwise bitter medicines. It was not until much later that it began to replace honey as an ordinary means of sweetening. Sugar reached England around 1319 and was popular in Sweden by 1390. It was an expensive and exotic novelty, mostly found in its traditional role in medicine. Sugar made palatable the foul-tasting mixture of medicinal herbs, entrails, and other materials typical of the medieval pharmacopoeia. In the age before antibiotics, it was commonly used to pack wounds before binding them, as the desiccant action of the sugar may have aided healing. The Spanish planted sugarcane in their Caribbean holdings, and they can claim the dubious distinction of introducing slavery into the New World for the purpose of producing sugar. Until 1550, the only sugar imported from the Western Hemisphere consisted of a few loaves brought as proof of the possibility of production or as mere curiosities. The plantings in West Atlantic islands and the New World had no effect on production, distribution, or prices until the latter half of the 16th century, and only became dominant from about 1650. Sugar as addiction. Is it stretching a point to discuss sugar in a history of human drug use? It is not. Sugar abuse is the world's least discussed and most widespread addiction, and it is one of the hardest of all habits to kick. Sugar addicts may be maintenance users or they may be binge eaters. The depth of serious sugar addiction are exemplified by bulimics, who may binge on sugar-saturated food and then induce vomiting or use a laxative to purge to enable them to eat more sugar. Imagine if a similar practice were associated with heroin addiction. How much more odious and insidious the use of heroin would then seem. As with all stimulants, ingestion of sugar is followed by a brief euphoric rush, which is itself followed by depression and guilt. Sugar addiction rarely occurs alone as a syndrome. Mixed addictions, for example sugar and caffeine, are more common. There are other destructive patterns of drug use that accompany sugar abuse. Some addicts use diet pills to help them control their soaring body weight and then tranquilizers to mitigate the jitteriness caused by the diet pills. Sugar abuse is often involved in the development of serious alcohol abuse. An absolute correlation has been shown between high sugar consumption and high alcohol intake outside meals. After alcohol and tobacco, sugar is the most damaging addictive substance consumed by human beings. Its uncontrolled use can be a major chemical dependence. In describing sugar addicts, Janice K. Phelps has said, "The people we are describing are addictive people who are indeed addicted to one of the most powerful substances to be found anywhere, the refined sugars. Their addiction to sugar is a real, harmful, highly damaging health problem, just as debilitating as addiction to any other substance. Like any addiction, when their chemical isn't supplied, they suffer identifiable withdrawal symptoms. Like any addiction, the process of feeding their physiological hunger with a chemical is destructive to the body, and like any addiction, the point may be reached when supplying the chemical becomes as painful as withdrawing from it. The cycle of chemical dependence becomes both entrenched and intolerable." Sugar and slavery. The distortion and dehumanizing of human institutions and human lives caused by crack cocaine today is nothing compared with what the European desire for sugar did in the 17th and 18th centuries. One may argue that something approaching slave labor is typical of the early stages with cocaine production, but the difference is that it is not slavery sanctioned by mendacious popes and openly pursued by corrupt but legitimate governments. A further difference must be noted. Brutal as it is, the modern drug trade is not involved in anything resembling the wholesale kidnapping, transporting, and mass murder of huge populations, as was done to further the process of sugar production. True, the roots of slavery in Europe reach far back. During the golden age of Periclean Athens, fully two-thirds of the city's residents were slaves. In Italy at the time of Julius Caesar, perhaps one-half of the population were slaves. Under the Roman Imperium, slavery became increasingly insupportable. Slaves had no civil rights, and in court disputes their testimony was acceptable only if it had been obtained by torture. If a slaveholder were to die suddenly or under suspicious circumstances, then all of his slaves, without regard to guilt or innocence, were quickly put to death. It is fair to say that the reliance of the Imperium on the institution of slavery must mitigate any admiration that we might feel for the grandeur that was Rome. In truth, the grandeur of Rome was the grandeur of a pigsty masquerading as a military brothel. Slavery diminished with the dissolution of the empire, as all social institutions dissolved into the chaos of the early Dark Ages. Feudalism replaced slavery with serfdom. Serfdom was somewhat better than slavery. A serf could at least maintain a home, marry, till the land, and participate in communal life. Most important, perhaps, a serf could not be separated from or transported off the land. When the land was sold, the serf nearly always went with it. In 1432, Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, who was more manager and entrepreneur than explorer, established the first commercial cane sugar plantation in Madeira. Plantings of sugar were made in the other eastern Atlantic holdings of Portugal more than 60 years before there was contact with the New World. More than 1,000 men, including debtors, convicts, and unconverted Jews, were taken from Europe to work in the sugar operations. Their condition was one of quasi-servitude, somewhat akin to the penal colonists and indentured servants who populated Australia and some middle Atlantic American colonies. Sugar cane was the first crop to be introduced into commercial cultivation in the New World. It is reliably estimated that by 1530, less than 40 years after the initial European contact, there were more than a dozen sugar plantations operating in the West Indies. In his book Seeds of Change, Henry Hobhouse writes of the beginning of African enslavement. In 1443, one of Prince Henry's returning captains brought news of a capture at sea of a crew of black Arabs and Moslems. These men, who were of mixed Arab-Negro parentage and Moslems, claimed that they were of a proud race and unfit to be bondsmen. They argued forcefully that there were in the hinterland of Africa many heathen blacks, the children of Ham, who made excellent slaves and who they could enslave in exchange for their freedom. Thus began the modern slave trade, not the transatlantic trade which was yet to come, but its precursor, the trade between Africa and southern Europe. Hobhouse goes on to describe sugar slavery in the New World. Sugar slavery was of quite a different order. It was the first time since the Roman latifundia that mass slavery had been used to grow a crop for trade, not subsistence, in a big way. It was also the first time in history that one race had been uniquely selected for a servile role. Spain and Portugal voluntarily abjured the enslavement of East Indian, Chinese, Japanese, or European slaves to work in the Americas. The slave trade was itself a kind of addiction. The early importation of African slave labor into the New World was for one purpose only, to support an agricultural economy based on sugar. The craze for sugar was so overwhelming that 1,000 years of Christian ethical conditioning meant nothing. An outbreak of human cruelty and bestiality of incredible proportions was blandly accepted by the institutions of polite society. Let us be absolutely clear. Sugar is entirely unnecessary to the human diet. Before the arrival of industrial cane and beet sugar, humanity managed well enough without refined sugar, which is nearly pure sucrose. Sugar contributes nothing that cannot be gotten from some other easily available source. It is a kick, nothing more. Yet for this kick, the dominator culture of Europe was willing to betray the ideals of the Enlightenment by its collusion with slave traders. In 1800, virtually every ton of sugar imported into England had been produced with slave labor. The ability of the ego-dominator culture to suppress these realities is astonishing. If it seems that too much ire is vented on the sugar habit, it is because in many ways the addiction to sugar seems a distillation of all the wrong-headed attitudes that attend our thinking about drugs. Sugar and the Dominator style. When temporal distance from the original partnership paradise increases, when the connection with the vegetable feminine matrix of planetary life slips far into the past, then the hold of cultural neurosis increases and manifestations of unchecked ego and dominator theories of social organization proliferate. Slavery, almost unknown during the medieval period, when the notion of private property restricted ownership of anything to a privileged few, returned with a vengeance to fill the need for manpower in the labor-intensive colonial cultivation of sugar. Thomas Hobbes' vision of human society as the inevitable subjugation of the weak by the strong, and Jeremy Bentham's notion of the ultimate economic basis of all social worth, signal that values that seek to nurture the earth and to participate with it in a life of natural emotive balance have been forsaken for the rapacious self-centeredness of Faustian science. The soul of the planet, shrunken by Christian monotheism to the dimensions of a human being, is finally denied any existence at all by the heirs of Cartesian rationalism. The stage is then set for the evolution of a human self-image that is entirely disensouled, adrift in a dead universe devoid of meaning and without moral compass. Organic nature is seen as war, meaning becomes contextual, and the cosmos is rendered meaningless. This process of deepening cultural psychosis, an obsession with ego, money, and the sugar-alcohol-drug complex, reaches its culmination in the mid-20th century with Sartre's appalling assertion that nature is mute. Nature is not mute, but modern man is deaf, made deaf because he is unwilling to hear the message of caring, balance, and cooperation that is nature's message. In our state of denial, we must proclaim nature mute. How else to avoid facing the awful crimes we have committed for centuries against nature and each other? The Nazis said that Jews were not true human beings and that their mass murder was thus not of any consequence. Some industrialists and politicians use a similar disensouling argument to excuse the destruction of the planet, the maternal matrix necessary to all life. Only a terminal addiction to the ego and styles of brutal domination could give rise to a mass mental environment in which such statements could appear plausible, let alone true. Sugar stands at a watershed in such matters, for sugar and the caffeine drugs that spread with it reinforce and support industrial civilization's unreflecting emphasis on efficiency at the price of archaic human values. The Drugs of Gentility. In the opening lines of his magnificent poem Sunday Morning, Wallace Stevens delivers an image of radiant transcendence and the familiar and ordinary worthy of Cezanne. Complacencies of the peignoir and late, coffee and oranges in a sunny chair, and the green freedom of a cockatoo, upon a rug mingled to dissipate the holy hush of ancient sacrifice. Stevens's lines evoke an aura of genteel satiety that surrounds the drug caffeine. Sunday Morning reminds us that our stereotyped notion of what constitutes drugs is strained when we are asked to consider such delicate accessories of bourgeois sensibility as tea, coffee, and cocoa as being in the same category as heroin and cocaine. Yet, all are drugs. Our unconscious striving to find our way back to the sensory ratios of prehistory has led us to develop countless variations on the act of paying homage to plant-based psychoactivity. Mild stimulants, with non-destructive or manageable impact, have been a part of the diet of primates since long before the emergence of hominids. Caffeine is the alkaloid that lies at the basis of much of the human involvement with plants that stimulate. Caffeine is a powerful stimulator well below the toxic dose. It occurs in tea and coffee and in numerous other plants such as Ilex paraguariensis, the source of mate, or Paulinia yoko, an appetite-suppressing Amazonian liana, which have their own localized but ancient and highly ritualized styles of use. Caffeine is bitter, and the inevitable discovery that it could be made more palatable with the addition of honey or sugar set the stage for the very prevalent and little-remarked synergistic effect that occurs between sugar and the various caffeine beverages. Sugar's tendency to become addictive is reinforced if sugar is also being used to make the ingestion of a stimulating alkaloid such as caffeine more palatable. Sugar is culturally defined by us as a food. This definition denies that sugar can act as a highly addictive drug, yet the evidence is all around us. Many children and compulsive eaters live in a motivational environment primarily ruled by mood swings resulting from cravings for sugar. Coffee and tea, new alternatives to alcohol. For all practical purposes, we can say that tea, coffee, and cocoa were introduced simultaneously into England in the 1650s. For the first time in its history, Christian Europe had an alternative to drinking alcohol. All three were stimulants, all were brewed with hot water that had been boiled, and thus rendered free from the then rampant problem of waterborne diseases, and all required copious amounts of sugar. The sugar craze promoted coffee, tea, and chocolate use, which in turn promoted sugar consumption, and the new stimulants were grown in the same colonial holdings then proving so profitable in the production of sugar. Tea, coffee, and cocoa held out the possibility of crop diversification in the colonies, and hence the greater economic stability for both colony and mother country. By 1820, many thousands of tons of tea were being imported into Europe each year, with about 30 million pounds being consumed in the United Kingdom alone. The tea for the European market all came from the southern Chinese coastal city of Canton from the mid-17th to the early 19th centuries. The tea buyers were not allowed to penetrate inland, nor were they privy to any of the details of the cultivation and cropping of the tea plant. As Hobhouse writes, history's joke on Europe is that for nearly 2 centuries a commodity was imported halfway across the world, and that a huge industry grew up involving as much as 5% of England's entire gross domestic product, and yet no one knew anything about how tea was grown, prepared, or blended. Such ignorance was no barrier to the commercial exploitation of tea. However, the Turkish capture of Constantinople in 1453 certainly was. When trade routes through the eastern Mediterranean were in the hands of the Turk, there was considerable pressure on the sciences of navigation and shipbuilding to perfect the ocean route to the east via the Cape of Africa. The route was discovered in 1498 by Vasco da Gama. When Dutch and Portuguese navigators eventually reached the Moluccas in eastern Indonesia, then called the Spice Islands, spices became much cheaper in Europe, and the struggle among all parties to create monopolies was joined. The type of organization best able to maintain a monopoly was the trading company, a group of merchants drawn together to reduce capital risks and competition. The large, well-armed ships of the various East India Companies spelled the end of the age of the self-employed merchant captain. The British East India Company, destined to become the most important of the trading companies, was founded in 1600. From that date until 1834, when free trade liberals opened the tea trade to all interested parties, the company controlled the tea trade to its great advantage. The British East India Company was believed to add at least a third to the price of tea, thus taking £100 a ton out of the 375,000 tons imported during the 18th century. This global figure obscures the rise, on the same basis, of the East India Company's cut from a sum equivalent to $17 million at the beginning of the century to an annual equivalent of $800 million in 1800. The East India Company was big business, hated and loathed by smugglers and consumers alike, and a symbol of corrupt, complacent monopoly. Tea brews a revolution. Toward the end of the 18th century, the tea trade was in crisis, and the government of Lord North made a series of ill-considered decisions that were not only to ruin the tea trade, but were also to lose England her colonies in North America. North's strategy was to sell tea at reduced prices in the colonies, thus diminishing surpluses and driving smuggler competitors out of business. He also sought to place a small and, he imagined, inconsequential tax on tea going to the colonies, simply to force the unruly colonists to submit to imperial authority. As is common knowledge, this tea tax was the straw that broke the camel's back in the political foment that was then gripping the American colonies. On December 16, 1773, angry colonial radicals in Boston turned on His Majesty's tea ships and destroyed their cargo. The salty tea of revolution was brewed that night. And there were other tea parties at New York, Charleston, Savannah, and Philadelphia. The affair might have passed off in a few weeks had not the British response of closing the port of Boston made the Declaration of Independence inevitable. By the early 1800s, the tea trade was showing signs of strain. On the European continent, the Napoleonic Wars had left coffers depleted. The response had been to print paper money unsecured by gold, and this practice eventually resulted in serious inflation, Costs rose, product values rose much less, resulting in economic misery. The panacea to this economic impasse was opium. Exploitation cycles. The opium trade was nothing less than British terrorism waged against the population of China until the Chinese government's restrictions against the importation of opium were totally done away with. There is in these events a pattern that has been repeated in our own century. Just as the dealers of the drug tea turned to opium when their tea market suffered depression, so did Western intelligence groups such as the CIA and the French Secret Service turn their attention to the importation of cocaine in the 80s, after having lost near monopoly on heroin to the heroin-dealing mullahs of the Iranian Revolution. The history of commercial drug synergies, the way in which one drug has been cynically encouraged and used to support the introduction of others over the past 500 years, is not pleasant to contemplate. Perhaps that is why the exercise is so rarely undertaken. The cycles began with sugar. As discussed, sugar, whose existence depended on a savage slave trade, deepened its claim on consumers throughout the 16th century. The 17th century introduction of tea, coffee, and chocolate only drove the craze for sugar to new heights. Through its use in caffeine drinks and distilled alcohol, sugar played a major indirect role in furthering the Dominator culture's suppression of the underclass and of women of all classes. Slavery to drugs is a tired metaphor, but in the case of sugar, the metaphor was made horribly real. When the tea market collapsed, the distributing system that had been put in place and capitalized by the British East India Company turned to the production and selling of opium and the exploitation of the Chinese population, which was outside of the colonial system proper. The invention of morphine, 1803, and then heroin, 1873, carries us to the threshold of the 20th century. Alarmed social reformers who attempted to legislate drug use only succeeded in driving it underground. There it remains, controlled today not by robber baron corporations operating under public charter, but by international crime cartels often posing as intelligence agencies. It is, as William Burroughs has remarked, not a pretty picture. Since the age of exploration, drugs and plant products have become increasingly important factors in the equations of international diplomacy. No longer are the distant tropical regions and peoples of the world to languish unattended by the rapacious eye of the white man. They have become production areas populated by an indentured labor force and expected to provide raw materials and a ready market for finished goods. Like the Maenads lost in the transport of Dionysian fury, the sugar-intoxicated dominator economies of Europe sought to devour their own children. Coffee. The 11th century Persian polymath Avicenna, who in 1037 became history's first recorded death from opium overdose, was one of the first to write about coffee, though it had been in use for some time in Ethiopia and Arabia, where the source plant occurred wild. On the Arabian Peninsula, it has long been known that coffee was a plant of marvelous properties. There's even an apocryphal story that when the prophet lay ill, he was visited by the archangel Gabriel, who offered him coffee to restore him to health. Because of the plant's long association with the Arabs, Linnaeus, the great Danish naturalist and the inventor of modern scientific taxonomy, named the plant Coffea arabica. When coffee was introduced to Europe, it was used as a food or medicine. The oil-rich berries were pulverized and mixed with fat. Later, ground coffee was mixed into wine and cooked to provide what must have been a quite stimulating and intense refreshment. Coffee was not brewed as a drink until around 1100 in Europe, and only in the 13th century did the modern practice of roasting coffee beans begin in Syria. Though coffee was an old-world plant and was used in some circles a long time before tea, nevertheless tea cleared the way for the popularity of coffee. Their stimulant properties made caffeine in coffee, and its close cousin theobromine in tea, the ideal drugs for the Industrial Revolution. They provided an energy lift, enabling people to keep working at repetitious tasks that demanded concentration. Indeed, the tea and coffee break is the only drug ritual that has never been criticized by those who profit from the modern industrial state. Nevertheless, it is well established that coffee is addictive, causes stomach ulcers, can aggravate heart conditions, and can cause irritability and insomnia, and in excessive doses, even tremors and convulsions. Contra coffee. Coffee has not been without its detractors, but they have always been in the minority. Coffee was widely blamed for the death of the French minister Colbert, who died of stomach cancer. Goethe blamed his habitual café latte for his chronic melancholia and his attacks of anxiety. Coffee has also been blamed for causing what Lewin called an excessive state of brain excitation, which becomes manifest by a remarkable loquaciousness, sometimes accompanied by accelerated association of ideas. It may also be observed in coffeehouse politicians who drink cup after cup of black coffee, and by this abuse are inspired to profound wisdom on all earthly events. The tendency to excessive raving after coffee drinking apparently lay behind several edicts against coffee issued in Europe in 1511. The Prince of Waldeck pioneered an early version of the drug snitch program when he offered a reward of $10 to anyone who would report a coffee drinker to the authorities. Even servants were rewarded if they informed on employers who had sold them coffee. By 1777, however, authorities in continental Europe recognized the suitability of coffee for use by the pillars of Dominator society, the clergy and the aristocracy. Punishment for a coffee offense by members of less privileged classes was usually a public caning followed by fines. And, of course, coffee was once widely suspected of causing impotence. It has frequently been stated that the drinking of coffee diminishes sexual excitability and gives rise to sterility. Though this is a mere fable, it was believed in former times. Olearius says in the account of his travels that the Persians drink the hot black water chaweh, whose property it is to sterilize nature and extinguish carnal desires. A sultan was so greatly attracted by coffee that he became tired of his wife. The latter one day saw a stallion being castrated and declared that it would be better to give the animal coffee, and then it would be in the same state as her husband. The Princess Palatine Elizabeth Charlotte of Orleans, the mother of the dissipated Regent Philip II, wrote to her sister, "Coffee is not so necessary for Protestant ministers as for Catholic priests, who are not allowed to marry and must remain chaste. I am surprised that so many people like coffee, for it has a bitter and a bad taste. I think it tastes exactly like foul breath." The physician-explorer Rauwolf of Augsburg, who later became the discoverer of the first tranquilizer, the plant extract Rauwolfia, found coffee apparently long established and widely traded in Asia Minor and Persia when he visited the area in the mid-1570s. Accounts such as Rauwolf soon made coffee a fad. Coffee was introduced in Paris in 1643, and within 30 years there were over 250 coffee houses in the city. In the years immediately preceding the French Revolution, there were nearly 2,000 coffee establishments operating. If wild talk is the mother of revolution, then certainly coffee and coffee houses must be its midwife. Chocolate. The introduction of chocolate into Europe is almost no more than a coda to the craze for caffeine stimulation that began with the Industrial Revolution. Chocolate, made from the ground beans of a native Amazonian tree, Theobroma cacao, contains only small amounts of caffeine, but is rich in caffeine's near relative theobromine. Both are chemicals with close relatives that occur endogenously in normal human metabolism. Like caffeine, theobromine is a stimulant, and the addictive potential of chocolate is significant. Cacao trees had been introduced into central Mexico from tropical South America centuries before the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors. There they had a major sacramental role in Maya and Aztec religion. The Maya also used cacao beans as the equivalent of money. The Aztec ruler Montezuma was said to be seriously addicted to ground cacao. He drank his chocolate unsweetened in a cold water infusion. A mixture of ground chocolate and psilocybin-containing mushrooms was served to the guests at the coronation feast of Montezuma II in 1502. Cortez was informed of the existence of cacao by his mistress, a Native American woman named Dona Marina, who had been given to Cortez as one of 19 young women offered in tribute to Montezuma. Assured by Dona Marina that cacao was a powerful aphrodisiac, Cortez was eager to begin cultivation of the plant. He wrote to the Emperor Charles V, "On the lands of one farm, 2,000 trees have been planted. The fruits are similar to almonds and are sold in a powdered state." Shortly thereafter, chocolate was imported into Spain, where it was soon extremely popular. Nevertheless, the spread of chocolate was slow, perhaps because so many new stimulants were then vying for European attention. Chocolate did not appear in Italy or the Low Countries until 1606. It reached France and England only in the 1650s. Except for a brief period during the reign of Frederick II, when it became the favorite vehicle for poisons used by professional poisoners, chocolate has steadily increased in popularity and annual tonnage produced. It is extraordinary that in the relatively short span of 2 centuries, 4 stimulants, sugar, tea, coffee, and chocolate, could have emerged out of local obscurity and become a basis for vast mercantile empires, defended by the greatest military powers ever known to that time and supported by the newly reintroduced practice of slavery. Such is the power of the cup that cheers but not inebriates.